My husband missed my birthday. No gift. No call. No explanation until the next morning. He said he was helping someone who needed him. What he didn't say was that the person he chose was his ex. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask him to explain. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive with proof, it arrives with a pattern. And the moment I realized I wasn't his priority, I stopped trying to be. He walked through the door at 6:40 a.m. the morning after my birthday. His keys landed in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, the familiar clink that used to mean home. This time, it sounded hollow. She was falling apart, he said casually, shrugging off his jacket. You're overreacting. My name is Elena Moore. I was sitting at the kitchen counter, staring into a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the entire night watching the clock roll past midnight, knowing exactly where my husband was, at his ex-girlfriend's apartment, while my birthday ended without him. He stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, looking tired but not guilty. That was the part that hurt the most. No hesitation. No apology. Claire called me around 8, he continued, opening the fridge. She had a panic attack. Her dad's been sick. What was I supposed to do? Ignore her. I didn't answer. Come on, he said, softening his voice. She just needed someone to talk to. I was 30 years old, married for 3 years, and I knew the difference between an explanation and a performance. This was a performance. You didn't answer your phone, I said quietly. I called you 6 times. It was on silent, he replied, like missing my birthday was a scheduling error. I didn't see them until this morning. Something settled inside me then. Not anger. Not shock. Clarity. I thought about every excuse I'd made for him. Every time I'd convinced myself that being understanding was the same thing as being respected. I looked down at my left hand. The wedding band, thin gold, simple, something I'd loved because it felt permanent. Without saying a word, I slid it off and placed it on the counter. The sound was soft. But it landed like a decision. His voice stopped mid-sentence. What are you doing? He asked. I stood up. My heart was racing, but my legs were steady. As I walked past him, I caught the faint scent of someone else's perfume on his shirt. I didn't say anything. The silence was the first honest thing between us in years. I wasn't always this quiet. Before him, I used to be loud, opinionated, expressive, the woman whose laugh people noticed across the room. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned how to shrink. As I opened the bedroom door and reached for my suitcase, a memory surfaced. The first time he mentioned Claire. 6 months into our relationship, high school sweetheart, he'd said casually. For years together. That kind of connection doesn't just disappear. I'd smiled. Told myself mature adults could be friends with their exes. But now, standing there, I could finally see the signs I'd ignored. The late-night texts he angled away from me, the coffee runs mentioned too casually. The earring I found in his car that he swore had to be from before me. I'd believed him, because believing him hurt less than the alternative. Behind me, he paced the hallway. Are you really doing this? He demanded. At least talk to me. I turned and met his eyes for the first time that morning. You spent my birthday with your ex, I said evenly. That's not how marriage works. He opened his mouth to respond. But I was already done listening. And before I walked out, I did one thing that would change everything. I didn't leave the apartment right away. Instead, I went into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. My suitcase sat half-packed on the floor, exactly where I'd left it after my last work trip. I stared at it for a long moment, then sat down on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. I wasn't looking for proof. I already had it. I just needed to stop pretending I didn't. His messages were still there. Weeks of them. Short replies sent late at night. Notifications silenced. Names saved without last names, a small trick I'd once laughed off at Claire. I scrolled. Can't talk now. She's home. Tomorrow instead? Miss you. My chest tightened, but I didn't cry. What surprised me most wasn't the messages themselves, it was how familiar the pattern felt. How many times I'd chosen trust over instinct. How often I'd swallowed doubt because I didn't want to seem insecure. I opened my calendar. Dinner reservations cancelled last minute. A weekend trip postponed twice. My birthday circled in red, untouched. He hadn't forgotten. He'd chosen. From the living room, I heard him pacing again. Elena, this is ridiculous, he called. You're blowing one night out of proportion. One night. I thought about the way he'd said her name that morning, casually, confidently, like she was still part of his life, not a chapter he'd closed. I stood and walked back into the kitchen. He looked up immediately, relief flashing across his face. There you are, he said. Let's just talk this through. I leaned against the counter. When was the last time you saw her before last night? I asked. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second. That's not fair, he said. You're interrogating me. I nodded slowly. So, recently. He exhaled, frustrated. She's going through a lot, he said. I didn't plan for it to be all night. All night, I repeated. On my birthday. He ran a hand through his hair. You know you're my wife, he said. That doesn't change. But I could hear it then, the problem with that sentence. Being his wife had become an excuse. An expectation that I'd stay. That I'd understand. That I'd forgive without being asked. I picked up my wedding ring from the counter and turned it over in my palm. When did you stop choosing me? I asked quietly. He frowned. I never stopped. I looked at him. You just stopped showing it. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. My phone buzzed in my hand. A notification. Claire, did he tell you I was struggling last night? I hope you're okay. My stomach dropped, not from jealousy, but from clarity. She knew. She knew exactly what she was doing. I turned the screen so he could see it. His face went pale. She texted you, he asked. Yes, I said. This morning. Like it's normal. I locked my phone and set it down. I'm not going to fight with you, I said calmly. I'm not going to compete with your past. He stepped closer. So what are you saying? I picked up my suitcase and zipped it shut. I'm saying I won't stay where I'm optional. I walked past him toward the door. Behind me, his voice finally cracked. Elena, wait. Don't do this. But I didn't turn around. Because sometimes walking away isn't dramatic. It's overdue. I stayed with my friend Maya that night. Her apartment was small, warm, and quiet, everything my own place hadn't felt like in a long time. She didn't ask questions. She just handed me a blanket and let me sit in silence on the couch. The next morning, my phone was already full. Missed calls. Texts stacked on top of each other. Where are you? We need to talk. You're overthinking this. Please come home. I read them without responding. At work, I moved through the day on autopilot. Emails, meetings, polite smiles. No one knew my marriage had cracked open less than 24 hours earlier. During lunch, I checked my phone again. Claire blocked me, one message read. I told her we need boundaries. Boundaries. I almost laughed. He'd never needed boundaries when it came to me. Another message followed. I chose you. I always choose you. But choosing someone after they've already walked away isn't the same thing. That evening, I finally replied. I need space. Please don't contact me unless it's necessary. The typing bubble appeared instantly. You're punishing me, he wrote. That's not fair. I set my phone face down. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. Over the next few days, pieces of the truth settled into place, not through confrontation, but through distance. I remembered moments I'd brushed aside before. How he'd flinch when his phone lit up. How he'd step outside to take certain calls. How work stress always seemed to peak whenever I asked for more of him. Clarity doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly, stacking detail after detail until denial collapses under its own weight. On the fourth day, he showed up at Maya's apartment. She texted me from the hallway. "He's here." "What do you want me to do?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied. "Let him up." He looked smaller standing there, less confident, less sure of his words. His eyes scanned my face, searching for something familiar. "I made a mistake," he said immediately. I cut her off. "I swear." I nodded. "I believe you," I said. Relief washed over him. "But that doesn't fix it," I continued. His smile faded. "It was one night," he insisted. "You're throwing everything away over one night." I met his gaze. "It wasn't one night," I said. "It was every time you chose comfort over honesty." He stepped closer. "I can change." I didn't doubt that he meant it. But wanting to change after consequences appear isn't the same as respecting someone before they're hurt. "I don't need promises," I said calmly. "I need peace." He stood there, silent. Finally, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Are you saying this is over?" I took a breath. "I'm saying I don't know who I am when I'm with you anymore," I said. "And I need to find out." His shoulders dropped. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. I didn't argue. Because for the first time, I trusted myself more than I trusted him. And that changed everything. A week passed without contact. No calls. No messages. No updates. The silence wasn't empty. It was clarifying. I moved back into my apartment while he stayed with a coworker. The place looked the same, but it felt different, like a house after a storm, quiet but exposed. One evening, while sorting through old documents, I found a folder I hadn't opened in years. Our joint finances. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to feel grounded, to understand what was actually mine. It's when I noticed it. Small charges. Consistent transfers. Expenses labeled as business that didn't line up with our accounts. Nothing dramatic. Just deliberate. I spent the next 2 nights going through statements, dates, patterns. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. He hadn't just been careless with my trust. He'd been careless with my contribution. Early in our marriage, I'd paused my own career to support his. We moved cities, adjusted schedules, took freelance work so his promotions wouldn't be disrupted. At the time, it felt like partnership. Now, it felt one-sided. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor. Then a lawyer. Not out of revenge. Out of responsibility. A few days later, he finally called. "I heard you were looking at our accounts," he said carefully. "I was," I replied. Silence. "That stuff is complicated," he added. "You don't need to worry about it." I closed my eyes. There it was again, the assumption. That I'd stay uninformed. That I'd trust without verifying. "I'm filing for separation," I said evenly. His breath caught. "You're serious?" "Yes." He rushed to fill the silence with promises. Therapy. Transparency. Starting over. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I spoke. "I don't want to rebuild something that only worked when I wasn't paying attention." He didn't argue after that. Because there was nothing left to minimize. That night, I packed the last of his things into boxes and left them by the door. I didn't cry. I felt steady. As if the weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. Sometimes the moment that changes your life isn't loud. It's the moment you stop explaining yourself. The paperwork was finalized 3 months later. No courtroom drama. No shouting matches. Just signatures, dates, and the quiet sound of a door closing. You divided what could be divided. Assets. Accounts. Memories that no longer belonged to both of us. He tried once more. A message sent late at night. I still think about you every day. I didn't mean to lose you. I read it without responding. Because intention doesn't erase impact, I moved into a smaller apartment across town, one with large windows and no shared history. I bought a second-hand table, hung my own art, and relearned what it felt like to make decisions without asking permission. Work picked up again. Clients I'd once turned down came back. Projects I'd delayed finally moved forward. With every small success, something inside me steadied. I wasn't rebuilding. I was returning. One afternoon, I ran into him at a grocery store. He looked surprised, then unsure. You look different, he said. I feel different, I replied. He stood there for a moment, surrounded by strangers who had no idea what we used to be. I never thought you'd leave, he admitted quietly. I nodded. Neither did I. And that was the truth. Walking away wasn't something I'd planned. It was something I grew into. That night, I lit a candle and opened the window. The city hummed below, alive, indifferent, moving forward. I thought about my birthday. How it ended alone. How I'd once believed being patient meant being loyal. Now I understood something else. Love isn't proven by how much you tolerate. It's proven by how much you respect yourself. I didn't leave to teach him a lesson. I left because I finally listened to my own. And sometimes, the quietest goodbyes are the ones that save you.